Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the vote, Reimagining What It Could Be. I'm Deondra Rose. I'm the Director of Research for Polis, the Center for Politics here at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy, and I am so excited to kick off the second day of our 2-day symposium. And I have to say, we have quite a roster of panels for you today. Yesterday, we talked about things ranging from how to motivate and mobilize young voters to a global perspective on voting, on civic engagement, on equitable democracy, and so many other conversations. We've heard research presentations from students who are doing innovative work, and we'll have more of the same today. So for our very first panel today, we are going to spend time with an all-star group that I am most used to hearing on North Carolina's NPR station and Frank Stacio's The State of Things. We have a wonderful panel of political scientists who will help us to understand what on earth is going on in this 2020 election cycle, and then to look a little more aspirationally about the future. So I would love to ask the panelists to please feel free to share their video, and I'm going to offer a few quick introductions. So first we have Professor Michael Bitzer. Dr. Michael Bitzer is the Leonard Chair of Political Science and Professor of Politics and History at Catawba College. He holds a master's in history from Clemson University and the doctorate in political science from the University of Georgia School of Public and International Affairs, Go Dogs. He serves as the chair of the Department of Politics and Pre-Law Advisor. His teaching and research interests are in American politics, public law, and public administration and policy, with specializations in Southern U.S. politics and North Carolina politics and voting behavior. He also manages and contributes to the amazing blog www.oldnorthstatepolitics.com. I follow it. Please follow it. I tell you, it is a wealth of information. I'd also like to present Professor Carrie Haynie. Professor Haney is Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at Duke University and Chair of Duke University's Academic Council. He earned a BA and a PhD, his BA and PhD degrees from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a master's degree from the University of Pittsburgh. Before coming to Duke in 2003, Professor Haynie was a member of the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania and Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. His research examines how the underlying theory, structure, and practices of American political institutions affect African Americans and women's efforts to organize and exert influence on the political system. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on African American politics, Southern politics, urban politics, and state-level politics and policy. Professor Haynie has traveled widely, speaking on race and politics, including invited talks in France, Germany, and South Africa. I'm excited to present Professor Susan Roberts. Dr. Susan Roberts is Professor of Political Science at Davidson College, Davidson, North Carolina. Her teaching specialties include the presidency, parties and interest groups, campaign strategy, the U.S. Congress, public policy, and the politics of reproduction. Her research includes work on activism on reproductive policy, interest groups, political capital, and #politics. I love that. Susan focuses on the use of model legislation in politics of access to abortion. She is a member of the Old North State Politics blog team. She is a commentator on radio and television, frequently on WFAE Charlotte Public Radio, WUNC Public Radio, NPR, Spectrum TV, WSOC, WCNC, Fox 46, and our panel. Really excited to have you here, Susan. She contributes to publications such as the Charlotte Observer, the Charlotte Post, many others. And she's recently the recipient of the Diane Blair Award from the Southern Political Science Association, which is presented biennially to a political scientist who has played an outstanding role in politics and/or government in his or her career. Thank you all so much for being with us today. I had to take a time to really share those accolades because we really do have an all-star lineup. So thank you so much for taking time to be with us.
Good to be with you.
So if I might start, okay, did you watch the debate last night? And what on earth? What are your takeaways? Like, what are some things you can't let go of?
Well, yeah, from my point of view, it was much better than the first presidential debate, but it really wasn't a debate because it felt like the candidates, particularly Senator Harris and Vice President Pence, came with their talking points. And there were some questions that they just said, that's a great question, but I'm going to answer another question that you didn't ask me. And, I thought it was really intriguing that both of them decided not to answer the question about your presidential candidate is in his 70s. What do you think, or what have you talked to that candidate about your relationship as vice president, and if in some day you have to become president? And they both kind of completely ignored it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I left watching the debate thinking, why did we do this? Given the fact that you didn't answer any of the questions or many of the questions, and particularly the one that Michael just raised, one of the most important ones in this election cycle is that come November 4th, we will have elected the oldest person to assume office in January. And so this was an important question for the candidates to address. So if they're not going to address questions or the questions that are asked, why do we do this? Let them go and do the campaign talks and stump speeches and see what we can learn from that, as opposed to taking up the time and good airtime to have a dog and pony show.
Susan, how about you? Let's see, Susan, we've got you on mute.
Okay, got me?
There we go.
Gotcha.
I take a little different spin on it than our other panelists, because it was so refreshing to see a debate in which we talked about the fly on Mike Pence's head instead of the meltdown and debacle that people were writing. This is the end of democracy. Some people wrote today, we'll forget about this debate come Saturday. And part of me is very relieved. It was, it was a debate with talking points. I felt so good that nothing important was said because the other debate was such a meltdown. And so, it was aggravating to watch. This one was kind of fun. You listened a little bit, but it wasn't at all like the first one. And I thought this one was going to be the fireworks going into the debate season.
Mm-hmm. So can we talk about the first debate then? Also, I'd love to bring that into the discussion. I feel like it was one of those events where if you were monitoring Twitter in the aftermath, there was just so much stress, and I think people were just we were all having a collective meltdown because it was just a mess. And, for me, I walked away just thinking about the noise. Like I just needed to go be quiet for a couple days. How about you?
Well, I agree that the noise and the cacophony, it was just, really remarkable. And I think if I were someone in another country with no stake in the election, I would have turned it off immediately because it was so destructive. And I do believe perhaps it wasn't the end of democracy as we know it, but it was a black stain. And I think we will see this, as I told my students, I'm sure everybody on the panel did. You will remember this debate. You'll have Nixon, Kennedy, and you'll have this debate.
Yeah. One of the things I thought was interesting about the first debate, the presidential debate, was I think it reflects the times that we're in. So it was just a microcosm of what at least the last year and perhaps the last 3 years have been with this administration. A lot of noise, confusion, distractions. So it was sort of odd in that respect, but it sort of made sense if you put it in that larger scope. It was just what we've had the last 3 years.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I went into my campaigns and elections class the day before and said, okay, what should we expect? And I gave them a rubric of things to think about the candidates. Wednesday, the day after the debate, I walked in and I first started to say, I have to apologize because that was a complete embarrassment. And I should have asked this the day before in the previous class. I should have asked how many students had seen a presidential debate. And I asked the question afterwards, and a third of my students raised their hands and said, this was the first debate that I watched. And I said, you didn't see a presidential debate. This was not the traditional presidential debate. And I think in the spirit of the theme that y'all are doing with this conference, it really strikes me that students and young people today are getting a perception of our badly divided, polarized politics, as Kerry has said, that is kind of the norm for them. And I think that that's a potential danger for our democratic republic and how people growing up in this environment are going to participate. We need public participation. We need citizens engagement. But if they watch fiascos like that first presidential debate, I can't fault them for saying, why?
Yeah, I think that's right on the money. And if I can stay on this idea of modeling, I mean, I think we can also, I think what another thing that's on our minds is the fact that this election process is occurring in the midst of a pandemic. And so I think, you know, we're looking to the candidates to see how they are engaging in campaign activities at this time. So, you know, one big question in the first debate was regarding the use of masks. And President Trump really came out and spoke vocally about how, you know, every time you see Joe Biden, he's got on this big mask. And then, you know, the next thing we know, he's actually diagnosed with coronavirus. And so last night we saw these really big plexiglass dividers between the candidates. You know, any sense of, you know, again, thinking about what young people, what other people who are maybe, you know, maybe not citizens watching, you know, as immigrants and or as residents in the US, or the global community watching this process, you know, I'm just wondering about those images and what that conjures up.
Well, if I might jump in, I'd like to look back from this and go to 2018 and look at the influx of diversity in people running for office, getting elected for office. That's where I'd like to see the young people focusing, and to think that that can translate into 2020 into turnout. I think, I don't believe, quite frankly, that the American public is going to spend a lot of time thinking about the hypocrisy, quote unquote, between what Mitch McConnell said and what he's doing. That they've come to expect that. But I think they can recognize, and quite frankly, I will call it hypocrisy between what Trump, how he's downplaying this, and he's reckless with this. Mm-hmm. And I think, unfortunately for everyone in the White House, that's a tipping point. They're looking at that and saying, not only did this happen to him, and he did fine, as far as we know, but look at all the people that have been affected by his lack of wearing a mask. So I think, as you pointed out, and Michael, to go back and let's see if 2018 will be something our young voters remember, and not 2020 to this point.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And the news this morning of the Presidential Debate Commission wanting to move the second debate now to a virtual dynamic, to basically a Zoom format. And President Trump goes on Fox Business and says, I'm not doing it, which, you know, I guess it's 2020, and that's the best explanation that we can possibly use at this point in time. But it is just, you know, one continuous dynamic that feels like, to me, an avalanche that in a normal, quote unquote, political campaign year would just blow everything up. Now it's any day that ends in Y that seems to be the kind of avalanche that wipes everything in the past 24 hours out and covers everything until the next avalanche falls.
Yeah, let me jump in and say something about, you know, our students and students watching this and young people watching this. I think it's an exciting time in some respects, right? That this is a point in history that will be written about in the textbooks and the history books. Let's hope it's an aberration in many respects, but it's important nonetheless. There's so many lessons that could come from this year, this campaign year, and this administration. And one is that, you know, our democracy is fragile. You know, I've come to that realization as a professional political scientist. I never thought that I would be living in fear about the future of our democracy. I assumed and believed that the institutions were strong and would hold. And we've seen them challenged like no other, including, and I put the debate and the debates in that context as well. You never really thought we were going to get much policy out of those debates. We never got what we got a week ago. So let's put it all in the context, right? I think it's an interesting time, but will be a time from which lessons can be drawn about our democracy. And I predict that there will be some serious attention in Congress with changing some of the things that we have had with us for a long time. Maybe disclosures about health and finances may be something that becomes part of the statutes and the law, as opposed to an expectation and things of that sort. So it's very interesting in that regard.
I love that. And I, so to continue on this idea that moving forward, especially in the shorter term or the medium term, the composition of Congress is going to really matter for how we move forward and how we move beyond this. And that will really depend on how this election plays out, not just at the federal level or at the presidential level, but also with Congress and the Senate. And North Carolina has a really interesting Senate race, in which just like, nothing's going on in presidential politics, nothing's going on in North Carolina Senate race, is there? There actually is. Let's talk about this. So there has recently been a situation that's emerged with some text messages. Anybody want to weigh in on that?
Well, I'll start us off. And I think that at the first round of text messages, there were people that said, oh, this is pretty innocuous. It's just a romance. And then the second round came out, and I think people were taken aback. They saw marital infidelity. And even though we have lots of instances, Mark Sanford, for instance, who did resurrect a political career after his affair. I think that today or tomorrow, when the Army Reserve investigates this, that will be one of the determining factors, because that will go beyond just the public assessing this. That will be an official investigation and conclusion. But I think, as my fellow panelist and you will point out, people have voted already. And is this going to sway them? Are they going to let this calculate into the composition of the Senate? I don't know, but I wish I could have a little crystal ball to see what the average voter, how they're making their calculus into. If I vote for Tillis, the Republicans will control the Senate. If I, try to look away and vote for Cal Cunningham, do they think of the Senate control when they're looking in their vote?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. One of the things that you pick up here that's interesting in this Senate race and the dynamics, Deondra, you laid out, and that is for young voters, there may be a generational split here. All of us on this panel are old enough to remember our former Senator Edwards, right, when as the vice presidential candidate, that affair. Susan mentioned Sanford from South Carolina, the president himself, current president, right, and sexual scandals and affairs and the like. So there may be a generational split where older voters and observers have come to think, okay, now this is part of the norm. What's surprising? So here we go again. Younger voters may have a different reaction, not knowing, if they don't know that context, what that might mean. But it's an interesting dynamic and sad, perhaps, that this has become almost to be expected somewhere along the line whenever we have a campaign.
Yeah, if I could pick up on Carrie's point, I think we need to wait a couple more days and maybe get some public opinion polls and start to see if this is really filtering in through all of the noise that we are having to deal with. But public policy polling released a poll that was in the field just as the scandal was breaking. And I think they inserted a question and they asked people, is this enough to change your mind, to have an impact on your vote decision? And the question was split between people under the age of 45 and people over the age of 45. And so basically you're dealing with millennials and now Gen Zers. And what was fascinating was almost 75% of under 45 said, I don't care anything about this. And I think that to me is another sign of something I hope that we'll be able to talk about later, is this big picture notion of generational dynamics, the generational replacement and the tectonic shifts that's occurring not just here in North Carolina, but nationwide. And I think 2020 is feeling to me kind of like an inflection point if younger voters show up. That's the key.
I love that. Do you all think that younger voters are going to show up? Or, I mean, I'm curious, if you were to make a prediction, part of me just wonders about fatigue. I feel like, especially with the pandemic, especially as many, especially college-aged students are grappling with questions about, if they're enrolled in college, whether to go to campus, whether to go back, how will I vote? Where will I vote? There's so many questions, and research has shown that one of the biggest barriers to voter participation for younger voters is just a lack of concrete or solid information. Oftentimes, like, students, young people don't want to make a mistake. And so they would sooner say, you know what, this is confusing, I'm going to sit it out. What do you think youth turnout is going to look like this time around?
If it was not for the pandemic, I would have said it would be record youth turnout. There are a number of issues that have been raised in the course of this administration and the campaign that young people seem to be excited about and concerned about. Environment, protecting the environment is one. Young people, the racism, the attitudes of young people, whether they're conservative or liberal, they don't go for the racism that we've seen in the Trump campaign in particular. Some of the dog whistles, bullhorn kinds of politics. I don't think that works with younger folk. So I think there may have been some mobilization efforts because of being fed up with, those kinds of politics. Now, you raise an interesting question about the pandemic. I've been wondering what will turnout mean in a state like North Carolina with a large number of colleges and universities. And the students are not here. There have been some mobilization efforts in recent elections on the campuses themselves, right? So without the students being here, how will those mobilization efforts play out? Will they be mobilized in ways they have in the past to turn out? So I think the interest is there. I don't know if the mechanisms that we normally see for young folks turnout are operational.
Some of the research that I've done is looking at the registered voter pool. We've got about 7.2 million registered voters in North Carolina now, and nearly 36% of them are under the age of 40. That is a plurality. But the concern, as you raise, is this notion of, do they show up? And in 2016, in looking at millennials who are now basically 24 to 40 years old this year, but in 2016, only 53% of them showed up to vote. Compare that to boomers with a 79% registered voter turnout. So there's a kind of gulf between the generational cohorts that really could be determinative of what we see happen on November 3rd. What was really striking to me was this new generational cohort, 18 to 23-year-olds, Gen Zers, our college students, basically, traditional college students. In the midterm election of 2018, 31% of them showed up. Millennials, 33%. That's huge in a midterm election that had no statewide major race. Sense of, okay, maybe they're going to start punching up to their political weight this year and moving forward. We'll just have to wait and see.
Well, and I think too, going off both Carrie and Michael, I think that the uptick in 2018 was very significant. And I think we look at 2020, people are thinking the stakes are higher, and that's across the board. With 2016, I think there was a point of being jaded. There's a book I used to use in my class called The Good Citizen, and he really talks about how young persons are more likely to participate in other ways rather than voting. and this has been several years, but that they're likely to, protest for the environment, lobby, and voting seems kind of quaint to them. I don't think that's going to be the case anymore. And I think in terms of, as Kerry said, mobilizing when no one's on campus or being able to gather and work, I think that's going to be a problem. I think some people at Davidson's campus and all around, especially in North Carolina, looking at the historically Black colleges and universities, there has been an uptick and a concerted effort to get to the polls for all young people. And I think this is, we may talk about this later, but the Black Lives Matter movement, if young voters can take that impulse for protest and take protest to the polls, the impact will be dramatic and long.
Can I tag on something, Susan? I wonder also about gender issues and whether those issues might, somehow affect voter turnout. Like I've been thinking a lot about passing, for example, and the composition of the Supreme Court, what that could mean for reproductive rights. Might that be mobilizing for certain demographics, women perhaps, or certain segments of women?
Absolutely, and I think it will be something that motivates the younger voter. I think perhaps it will motivate some of the younger women because not simply access to abortion, but because she was a role model. And they don't see that coming with the new nominee, as far as I can tell. And I do look at the women's vote. The vote for women is not simply at the top of the list, access to abortion. Sometimes there are younger women who have always had access to abortion and tend to think it for granted. I think they will rethink that, and I think they will go. And I think they look around and see mansplaining or things like that, and they want a seat at the table. They want to be there, and I think younger women are going to mobilize. And for older women, I think it is when they look back and they say, "You need to know where we've come." And so I think younger women are going to look at it, as you said, in terms of reproductive freedoms, but also in terms of having a role model and somebody that was feisty and really, while she was liberal, I think, she was one that was reasoned and smart. And we see in the sciences, young women like to see smart women.
I love that. And Carrie, I want to go back to the issue of race, if I may, and to sort of tag onto this question of the role that the protests will have, whether the activism that we've seen in the last year, especially since March or the last few months, will translate into institutional participation. Do you think that Black Lives Matter will play a role in really pushing people to the polls?
That's been an interesting question for a number of years. And in this particular campaign cycle, I think it might. And why I think so is who the opposition is, at least from the perspective of Black Lives Matter. I think Donald Trump has done more to mobilize Black vote this time around than the Democratic ticket, for whom much of that support will accrue. So I think the opposition, that folks are mobilized by Donald Trump, refusing to disavow white supremacy, refusing to criticize the Proud Boys and other such groups, I think has sent a message and has been I think unwillingly for Trump, has helped his opposition, and the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, would be key in Black turnout.
So, maybe Michael, if I can target this question to you for starters, thinking about, we talked a little bit about the infrastructure and how we will vote. I'm just curious about mail-in voting. What will this look like? Do you have any, I teach this stuff and I'm all, so I don't know that we have a plan. I feel like there's so many, we have plans, I'm being facetious, but the plans are hot off the press. What effect might that have on turnout and participation this time around?
If I could find a GIF or GIF that just, does this, I think that would be, the most appropriate response. But being a political scientist, I look at numbers and I look at trends. This is exponential in North Carolina. We are at this morning 1.2 million requested absentee by mail ballots. That's almost 17% of every registered voter in this state has asked for an absentee by mail ballot. And out of that 1.2, we already have 420,000 North Carolinians who have voted. So nothing over the next 27 days is going to play any role in their vote decision, as Susan indicated earlier. This is just a dynamic that, we are just going to have to wait and see how things play out, because we've doubled 2016's total absentee by mail ballots. That's a record. Registered Democrats are 52% of all these ballots. It's typically registered Republicans that tend to utilize this vote method. We've got early voting starting on October 15th. Everybody write that date down. And you talk about the process. We're in kind of legal limbo at this point in time, because we've got 3 different lawsuits that we're waiting for basically a federal judge to make a decision. And he said, I'll issue my ruling next week. Well, next week means that we're now 14, getting into 2 weeks from the election day. Yes, this is chaotic. Yes, this is unnecessary at some points. But I think that there are so many built-in safety valves, particularly if somebody wants to vote from the convenience and safety of their home, request an absentee by mail ballot. You can do it online. You can then either mail it back, or if you don't trust the postal system, you can hand carry it to your county board of elections or to an early voting site and physically hand it over. Then you can track your ballot at the State Board of Elections website. You can get a text. I got a text that said, hey, your ballot's been accepted. I'm done. So there's a lot of confusion, but I think the state has done things, particularly with allowing those absentee by mail ballots to be processed, not necessarily tabulated, but processed now, to where we should get to November 3rd. The massive bulk of the first numbers that get reported will be by mail and in person. We might have 80% of the ballots cast before November 3rd.
Yes, can I jump in and ask Michael a question about those ballots that have been returned? So in the email that you received, and I have folks who have gotten similar kind of emails in my vote, does that mean your vote is a good vote? I mean, that it's counted and there are no mistakes on the ballot, or is it just it's been received? Because the concern I have is that come the time we start counting those ballots, there are mistakes, technicalities, that there may be some throwing out of votes that should actually count and having those contested. So what does it mean when you say that 400 and some thousand have been received? Are those good ballots? Or spoiled? They're not spoiled in that sense.
Right. This is a great question. There's a lot of confusion out there. First and foremost, 420,000 ballots have been returned and accepted. Okay. And of the returns, there's a little over 430,000. So about 10,000 have issues in terms of voters not signing the back of the envelope, or more importantly, witness incomplete information. And what I have noticed in the data is that it is disproportionately African-American voters who have never utilized absentee by mail voting. Vast majority in North Carolina want to vote in person. But as we've been talking about, COVID-19 and coronavirus is raising concerns. And so we have seen another exponential growth in African-American voters requesting absentee by mail ballots. They get them, they fill out the ballot, but maybe they forget to do the important things on the back of the envelope. Now, the fixing can be done. It's what's called curing the ballot. And typically, they are sent a second ballot saying, there was an issue with your first ballot. Here are clear instructions. Make sure to do all these things. And they have an opportunity to send it back in, or they could show up to vote in person. And if they voted in person, that automatically cancels their absentee by mail ballot. But you hear so much about this notion of rejected ballots. And that's something that that strikes me as disingenuous because they are deficient ballots. The voter has the opportunity to fix that ballot. And I think that that is a critical thing that unfortunately the media at times is not presenting the full picture.
And if I could jump in off of what Michael and Kerry have said, there was an NPR poll that really was talking about what concerns them most about their vote. And at the top of the list, which we can fix, was misinformation at 35%, all the way down to at near bottom was foreign interference, not very concerning. And in terms of safety at the polling place, they were also concerned about voter fraud. And I really like the top two, we can do something about. And I think to speak political science speak, and I was thinking of this just a moment ago, we look at things like internal political efficacy and external political efficacy. And internal means that you think you can figure it out and you know what's going on. And external is, but will the government listen to me? And I don't have any numbers, but I think you combine those. And perhaps younger persons will look and say, do I think the government is going to listen to me? Maybe not. So maybe I'll vote. Maybe I'll make that voice heard. But I think there's confusion. And I think that I've seen it from my friends who, weren't concerned. One young woman said, I need 2 absentee ballots. Can you get them for me? And I was going like, oh no. So I sent some information and said, here's where you go to request your absentee ballot, because they do ask for things like driver's license number and social security. So she said, oh, okay. And, that was just misinformation about early voting and how easy it was. And I think that if we look at the efficacy question, if people feel that they know what they're talking about in terms of government, and they want government to listen, this may increase the turnout. But I know people, and I've mentioned this to Michael, that have requested an absentee ballot, but still aren't sure if they're going to use it. And I think that gets to the safety concerns, the safety at the polling places. And trivial as it sounds, people are saying, I'm in a line, maskers and anti-maskers. And is that going to make me tense? How do I just step back and say nothing when I may feel my personal safety is jeopardized? So I think that's maybe a little part, but I think you put all these things together and it's going to have an impact on turnout. But as I think Carrie and you and Michael would say, I think we're going to have heavier turnout than usual because people know what the stakes are.
Well, another question, John, if I might, that comes up in my mind as a political scientist, is what are the parties doing? So it seems to me that the political parties now exist only for the purposes of the candidates. So this voter education is an interesting piece, right? That who does voter education? Do we teach civics in the public schools? What do we do as college professors in that regard? So the fact that folks are having problems and issues with how to cast a ballot, it seems to me that the parties should be mobilized to make sure that at least their side, that their people, their supporters, their registered supporters know exactly what the process is and make an effort to do that. It concerns me that the number, Michael, you mentioned 10,000 plus of these ballots that have been cast and are deficient. And so I worry about the health of the democracy if we don't have more civic education and that we can't rely on the parties to do it, and somehow figure out how to increase voter knowledge about the process.
I want to pick up on one of these sort of logistical questions. Should we be worried about the number of poll workers who will be present on election day in states like North Carolina or just across the country?
I think so. The typical volunteer is a retired person who you go to the poll and they retire and they come and do civic duty. In this pandemic, there are some vulnerabilities there. And many of those people who I normally see at my poll shouldn't be there, and I hope they're not, for their own personal safety. So in that regard, I'm scared to go too, but I volunteered to be a poll worker, and I'm on call to work the polls. I'm somewhat younger, somewhat less vulnerable, and I'm willing to do that because I think the process has to function as smoothly as possible. But yes, it's a legitimate question, a significant question, and one that, as Michael said earlier, we have to wait and see how this is going to play out.
Another question, something that I'm hearing interesting things about is just this issue of voter fraud. You know, from one perspective, it's rampant and we really need to have rules to make sure that it doesn't happen. From another perspective, actually, it's very rare. If there are instances in which, you know, there are some aberrations, it's usually on the part of the sort of the administrating body and, you know, mistakes on that side, not people trying to vote twice. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I was so unhappy when President Trump intimated that North Carolinians should vote twice, and even more worried that Attorney General Bill Barr did not know if that was a problem or a felony. I think that some of the voters, when they look at voter fraud, they don't realize, and Michael has written a piece for the Washington Post about this, the difference between voter fraud and election fraud. And that's a very huge difference. And I think I might let him address what happened in the 9th Congressional District.
Well, I mean, you know, if North Carolina needs any other, you know, example, we have it from 2018 and actually potentially prior to 2018, this was going on. The concern is, or was at that time, people intercepting people's absentee by mail ballots, and that process has been closed off. What is of concern, as Susan noted, was the president saying, well, these absentee by mail ballots, anybody can get a ballot. Well, no, first and foremost, there are records, digital electronic records that indicate who has requested one. The ballot then has a scan code, and we can track where that ballot is in the process. So this notion of 80 million ballots being flooded around that can be accepted is a joke. It's non-existent. And then the other concern was, well, vote by mail and then show up in person. You can't do that. Once your ballot is accepted, the poll workers will know that your ballot has been accepted, and you can't vote twice. You could vote provisional if you think that there was an issue with your ballot, but that first ballot is your legal ballot. So, you know, this again, this notion of just blatant either misinformation willingly or intentionally to cause confusion is really damaging to our process, but this is part of what we're having to deal with, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. I love that. So let's see, I also wanted to ask about the media and what you're seeing covered, and, you know, especially in an election when having solid, clear information is critical. Do you think that what we're hearing a lot about is really what we need to be hearing about this cycle?
I mean, I'm sure all of us have been just inundated with reporters' calls. It's nonstop from day to day. I'm afraid at times we tend to get wrapped up in the literal avalanche of news of that day and more concerned about the horse race, who's up, who's down, which states are trending which direction. And we don't seem to have a lot of policy discussions. That's kind of, unfortunately, the norm. It's more about who's up and who's down, as opposed to what the policy issues that these candidates would be bringing. Having been a former reporter, I know how difficult it is, and I'm appreciative of them reaching out to people like yourselves who are experts and can explain things. But sometimes reporters come with a narrative that they want to write a story around, and they will search for the quote that provides it, no matter who they go to. And I think that, in my mind, does a disservice. It's a small percentage, but I've gotten some of those calls this year, and I know exactly where the reporter is going with it. And I try my best, but this is the situation we're in.
And I think I would also point out, which I think as political scientists, we recognize and reiterate, and that is where people get their news. And that are, you know, the echo chambers, and they don't have to listen to anything else. And they just consume one of the liberal stations like MSNBC or Fox News. That's all they do. They don't go anywhere else for their news. And unfortunately, print media is declining. And I think that when we look at what we want the media to do, it is to uncover somewhat of the truth. Now, one thing that's bothered me about campaigning and the media is that we've known about these things called deep fakes, in which there is all kinds of negative campaigning, and there have been, really what to do about it. And then you study it, you turn it in here. It's like the damage is done. You can't follow that story, and the immediacy of the moment when a story comes out and then there's another story, and we've used the word avalanche, and I think that's totally accurate. And it's difficult for the media to do their job, because sometimes it gets, what do you want to say, until 6 o'clock in the evening, then we have punditry. Well, maybe people are watching more media now, but I still think they see it as, they see bias, and they only want their side of the story. And that's something we all know.
Yeah, quickly, let me add here to that. I've been pleasantly surprised this cycle that reporters have asked me what I consider to be some foundational questions. There's some concern again about the institutions of democracy and are they at risk? And I think those have been healthy questions. I think that's something that is in the public interest. So I appreciate those kinds of questions. But the thing that bothers me the most when it comes to the media is this notion that there are always two sides that you have to present. The one we just previously discussed about voter fraud, there's no evidence of that, very little evidence. So why even entertain that as a serious question when a campaign raises it with the lack of evidence, right? So they know there's no evidence. And then they have a whole segment on something that doesn't exist. And that gives it some credibility when they raise it in that context. It bothers me that they know, but they have this pressure or this need or this desire to so-called be balanced and play both sides of an issue when there may not be more than one side.
And could I jump in on one more piece? I guess we could call it the media when we talk about Twitter. There was a cover story on the New York Times this weekend. And I think that that's reactionary. It's not reflective, but people look at their Twitter accounts. They look at this and they want, sometimes they say, what else did the president say? And if he's talking incessantly about a rigged election, then that's going to be something that perhaps they never thought about. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have to acknowledge that Twitter is part of the media, is the media, and the media is social media. And how do we study the impact of that right now in 2020? It wasn't 2016, of that on younger voters. And so I wanted to expand to say, yes, we got to think about social media, because it is, to me, more damaging than, or maybe informative, but I think with Trump's tweets and to talk about conspiracy theories, it can be very destructive.
Thank you so much. So to stay on this topic, we've got a great question from the audience. Ryan Partridge asks or says, I like how Professor Bitzer told his students that they didn't see a presidential debate. I'm concerned by the amount of gravitas that many credible public influencers give to that sort of spectacle. Even if the explicit message is disapproval, does all the attention send the implicit message that politics is entertainment, fostering that public sentiment? If so, how might that be avoided?
That is a fascinating question. And, I feel like we're living in the Truman Show, that this is reality TV gone awry at times, that it's all about entertainment for entertainment's sake. And we have a president, we have to acknowledge, we have a president who was a reality TV star, and he sees things through ratings. That that drives his modus operandi, if we need to boil it down to basic fundamentals. And I think a day without his name in the news is a day that he can't stand, and that has disrupted, as Carrie said, the institutions, but the unwritten rules, the norms that we go through, that we generally tend to expect a president is going to act like this. And yes, Trump said when he was campaigning in 2015 and 2016, I'm not a politician. And he has proven that. He has shown us that he is willing to disrupt the entire structure of our government. To what end and to what effect is the concern, as not just a political scientist, but as an American citizen, that I have in this kind of dynamic.
Well, I think we think of politics sometimes as dirty, but politics, if you think in terms of compromise, consensus, deliberation, it's not necessarily a negative term. And he did campaign, as I think we'd all agree, on anti-establishment. I'm not a politician. I'm going to listen to people that haven't been heard. But the decision now in 2020 is so much different than 2016, because I think people do hunger for people getting involved, and it's not just a lack of civility. I think we've gone far beyond that. And I think we crave deliberation and discussion. So I think that, it is far deeper. And some of my students have said, and this is a Southern expression, this is the dirtiest in 2016, the dirtiest campaign I've ever seen. And I go, bless your heart, you've only seen one. So we'll get to look at 2020.
So yeah, 2020 was like, what do they say? Hold my beer.
Exactly.
All right, so we've got another question from the audience, from Scott Kuhn. Scott says, what are the prospects for a repeat of the Brooks Brothers riot in 2000, or various shenanigans, such as secretaries of state refusing to certify results based on the spurious claims of voter fraud? Is it likely that this election is going to be decided in the Supreme Court?
Well, Donald Trump seems to think that it will, and that's why he's pushing his nominee, and he's backed off some of the other things about, even though he came back, he's mercurial, and that everyone would say that. They may appreciate it, they may see it as very frightening, but you cut off the COVID relief one day, you put it back on, and you say we want to talk about the nomination, because we want to get someone on the court that if this and this may come to the courts, I'll have a friendly audience. That saddens me, because I don't want to necessarily predict that every Supreme Court justice is going to vote the way the person that appointed them would like. I would hope not, but I think that's become the assumption. And so I think that people are worried about fraud and what will happen, but to say it's going to end up in the Supreme Court is sad. It may be angry, it may make you angry, but it's also sad.
I expect there to be some shenanigans, and we may not have a vote that's certified election night. But I think, particularly as political scientists, we'll have an indication of what the outcome is. There'll be some states, right, in which the ballots will have been counted. If the president loses Florida, I think Ohio, which is behind in both states, I don't need to see anything else. You can wait a month. And, let's have some real shenanigans. He would have lost the race in the campaign if he loses Florida and Ohio. And we'll know some states, election night, I think we'll know enough states that as a political scientist, I'd be confident in making a prediction. Again, it may not be a certifiable outcome, and we have to wait for the certified vote. So perhaps there'll be some challenges, but we may know enough to put some of that to rest.
Thank you. So let's see, I think, one question I'd like to ask, and I just want to make sure I touch on this because Susan raised this in an earlier back and forth just about whether sort of big picture we should be concerned about, or to what extent the chaos surrounding the integrity and legitimacy of this election, like really thinking about what this cycle is going to mean for the longer arc of democracy in the U.S. and democratic politics. What are your thoughts on this? Like, what impact will this have on this broader history?
I'll let somebody start it off.
Yeah, let me say this, and there have been some bitter campaigns. I go back when my high school days, when Ronald Reagan was a candidate. I was at the polar opposite of Ronald Reagan. But Ronald Reagan never, ever did. And we could disagree on policy. And the folks who I voted against, I've never heard a candidate, call into question the institutions, things that are vital to our democracy, to call into question even the vote, So this is something unusual and something new. And it goes beyond me just being on the opposite side of someone. This is something different than that. I mean, this is not me not liking something being a Democrat as opposed to a Republican. We've never seen a sitting president or even a serious candidate attack the system in this way, and it is concerning. So I worry about the long term, but I hope this is just a brief episode and we swing back to some normalcy regardless of the outcome of the election.
Thank you, Carrie.
Yeah, I kind of look at it in a couple of different ways. First and foremost, what Carrie said earlier about the institutions and the institutions perhaps breaking under the strain. I have to remind my students that institutions are made up of individuals. And if individuals choose to play by the rules of the game, both the written rules and the unwritten rules, we get a system. If they choose not to, there's nothing that the institutions can do per se in that regard. The other thing that I've really been thinking about from the big picture is, are we at an inflection point with this election? Meaning, are we seeing a kind of regime change from the Reagan coalition, as Kerry noted? Is that coalition coming to an end? And is the millennial generation coalition of Barack Obama going to assert itself and transition the country in a way? There's a political scientist that talks about disjunctive presidents that come in and say, I can fix these things and I alone can fix them. That's normally the indication of, okay, that coalition that has been governing is coming to an end, and we see a new coalition emerge. We'll just have to wait and see.
Well, I think too, we've looked at people that talk about the direction of the country, and it's increasingly troubling that only 65%, troubling that 65% think we're going in the wrong direction. I worry too that young people or citizens in general are becoming jaded. Well, Trump's not going to release his tax records. Well, you don't have to comply with the government subpoena. And I think you have enough of those things that it really erodes trust. And so many of our institutions really depend on trust. It's not separation of powers, it's separate institutions sharing powers. And I think Michael's right to talk about them in terms of individuals, but we have to look at elections have consequences, and they are a collective response to a lot of problems and people. And I wish I could say that, it's going to be pleasant, and once Trump is out of office, things will, if he's out of office, once that happens, things will return to normal. And I always quote a line that I read in an article in The Atlantic prior to the election. And it said, Trump didn't cause the chaos caused Trump. And I think that's important for us to think about the coming challenges of changing demographics, income inequality, systemic racism. They're problems that will be here that we can't fix without long-term. And we've got to think about long-term instead of short-term.
Well, I have to say, I am excited to be connected with this particular panel of experts in the long term. I know where to find you all. Our audience members, you all know where to find these wonderful experts. Thank you so much to Professor Carrie Haynie, Professor Michael Bitzer, Professor Susan Roberts for being with us today, for sharing your amazing insights and helping us to make sense of the 2020 election. And all of our audience members, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you'll stick around. Our next session begins at 11:30. We're having another super panel of student activists from Duke, UNC, and North Carolina Central University talking about their role in activating young voters. So please stick with us, and thank you again to our wonderful panelists.
Thank you, Deondra.
Thank you, Deondra.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.